you shall be circumcised. That's a mystery there. Like, why that particular rite? Well, it's dramatic. I mean, it certainly affects a man where he's most concerned to be affected. There's something like that. And so it's a sacrifice that has a certain, I would say, a certain degree of unforgettability. That would be the first thing. And a certain degree of pain and threat that goes along with it. So it's not nothing. That's the thing. Now, you can argue, and I think there is an argument, a case to be made about whether or not in the modern world circumcision is a reasonable, is something reasonable to inflict on infants. I don't want to have that conversation at all. But I don't think that's relevant to this particular issue, because we're talking about something different. We're talking about humanity's attempt to reconcile themselves to the fact that something has to be given up in order for something else to happen, and to try to really work through that idea and to make it into a psychological reality. And so far what we've seen in the biblical stories is that when you make a sacrifice, it's not really something personal or psychological, right? It's something external and dramatic. You give up something that you own. You don't give up something that you are or that's part of you. And it's actually more of a sacrifice to give up something that's a part of you or something that you are than to give up something that you own. I mean, it's a subtle distinction because in some sense the distinction between what you own and what you are is subtle, right? I mean, it's not overwhelmingly subtle, but people identify with their possessions, and they need to, because otherwise they wouldn't care for them, and they need their possessions in order to live. So their possessions are in some sense integral to them. But this transformation here of an act that was external and associated essentially with possessions to something that was actually at least part of the body brings it much closer to the individual as a psychological reality. It's something like that. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. It's also a permanent marker, you know, and I've read a fair bit about practices like tattooing and body scarification, you know, those are very, very common practices, right? They're human universals, actually. No matter where you go around the world, I mean, you see a couple of things. First of all, almost without exception, people wear clothing. And sometimes it's relatively minimal clothing, and often it's more decorative than protective, but it's almost inevitably clothing. And the other thing that you see is that people do scarify and tattoo themselves, and they do that in some manner to catalyze their identity, right? They're trying to transform themselves from a generic person in some sense to a person that's been designed by their own hand. It's something like that. It's a marker of developing identity, and some of it seems to be catalyzed with pain. You know, the modern people who tattoo, and I'm not saying that I'm in favor of tattooing, because actually I'm not, but that's my own particular bias, and if you have a tattoo, that's fine with me. I'm also not saying that there's anything wrong with it. But one of the things you do see that people who have a tattoo do report is a couple of things, is that the pain is actually necessary, and that the pain is actually something that seems to establish something like a memory. So, well, it's a memory because of the pain, because you bloody well remember things that hurt, but it's also a memory because it's actually etched on you, right? It's not something that you can just abandon and forget. And so a circumcision is exactly the same thing. It's like you don't forget it because it's part of you. And so it makes a good token for a covenant. And so that seems to be the rationale here from speaking from a psychological perspective. It's to indicate as well that the damn thing that's happening is serious. And I think also that was the case with the earlier sacrifices of animals. It's like, modern people don't do this. Like, you don't know how serious you would take a vow if you sacrificed a goat in your backyard. You know, it's actually a very dramatic thing to do. You know, you think about it as primitive, and perhaps it is archaic, and no doubt it is. But it's also to take the life of something and to spill its blood. That's no joke. That's something you remember, especially if you haven't done it before. And we actually don't know what we would need to do in order to take some things seriously. You know, because we all do things like make New Year's resolutions about how we're going to be better people, and we don't do it. And the reason for that, at least in part, is because we don't know how to make the sacrifice sufficiently bloody, let's say, so that we remember that it's necessary, right? We don't take it with seriousness. We don't think, I should quit smoking because I'm going to die. And we don't think through what that means, like coughing your lungs out for 3 months in a hotel bed while your entire family is like half repulsed and horrified and sorrow-stricken at the fact that this has happened far too early. You know, we won't make that real enough to make it serious. And without that seriousness, we won't do it. So there's something to be said for rituals of seriousness. And I think this is one of them.